Sub tuum praesirium confugimus, Sancta Dei Genitrix, nostras te precationes, ne despicias in necessitatibus, sed a periculis cuntis, libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta.
Hello and welcome to Parousia Podcast. I am your host, Matthew-Hermann Tague, and as you may have guessed, there might be a little sacred musicness to this special Parousia Podcast because I am here with friend and founder, one of the founders of the Australian Sacred Music Association, Mr. Ronan Reilly. Ronan, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I also want to say a very special thank you to you and all of ASMA for the new partnership that is being developed between the Australian Sacred Music Association and Parousia, as we can see from the media wall in the background. So we're going to get into the Ronan Reilly story very, very shortly, but first we should probably talk a little bit about the Australian Sacred Music Association, also known as ASMA. It's a very unusual name for an organisation that deals with sacred music. So tell us about ASMA.
Well, funnily enough, we found out after the fact that ASMA is also an ancient Greek word for song. So that kind of worked really well with what we were trying to achieve. I guess, well, a number of countries across the globe have some sort of a sacred music association or a sacred music Church Music Association of America is another famous one. A group that's trying to drive the church's vision for sacred music, particularly in the last century. There were two in America from the early 1900s that formed into the 60s into the Church Music Association of America. And there was a new impetus given to the direction of national bodies to implement the ideals and reforms of sacred music across the last century in the 60s under Pope Paul VI, when he asked that national associations be formed to work together with the Pontifical Institute of Sacred Music in Rome. So a number of us found 15 or so years ago that there was nothing like that in Australia, and we fairly audaciously decided that we could form something that was quite small and had quite an audacious hope, which was to help sacred music come into the parish setting, into school settings, and basically try and help form the next generation and generations going forward in the sacred music tradition.
That's excellent. Yeah. That's a
so
very noble
10 years next November.
10 years, so we're coming up to the 10th anniversary.
Yep.
So look out, you're going to be hearing more podcasts, I suspect, on the Australian Sacred Music Association. But today, we want to ask the question, who is Ronan Reilly? So let's go backwards in time. Were you born into a Catholic family?
Yes, yep. So Irish parents.
Irish Catholic, yeah.
Yep.
I've got a very Irish, Scottish background myself,
Yep.
so well met. Tell us a little bit about your the Catholicism you experienced as a child and in the home.
I would say that both parents growing up in Ireland, mum particularly in the west of Ireland, in the Gaelic-speaking area, there was a very deep-rooted devotional faith. I wouldn't say it was particularly rooted in the liturgical tradition as such. We attended the local parish at St. Joseph's in Belmore, where I went to primary school and was baptised. The music that I grew up with there was far from what I came to discover at the cathedral in St. Mary's under Cardinal Pell when I joined the cathedral choir there in 2002 as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old. So growing up we had a strong devotional faith and a kind of piety for Our Lady and the saints, especially St. Patrick and St. Bridget, having the St. Bridget's cross, the little made of hay or whatever it's made of,
Mm-hmm.
a few of them around the house. And we went back to Ireland a number of times growing up, and you'd meet older aunts and uncles and grandparents, and you'd kind of see that infusion of the Catholic faith on a cultural level into the Irish home. Pretty much every home that we'd go into in Ireland would be an image of the Sacred Heart. So there was very much a pious kind of exposure to the faith, prayers before bed and such, but certainly didn't really experience much of that liturgical patrimony and richness until going to the cathedral in 2001.
Okay, and you said that you started going to the cathedral when you were about 10 years old?
Yeah, so my parents got married in the cathedral in '86, and they knew that there was a cathedral choir that specialised in sacred music. And growing up in primary school, I was involved in a number of little choirs in the parish and in the school, and just generally quite musical, I suppose, in the way I'd do things or pick up on things. Dad might be cutting a piece of wood with a saw, and I'd be there dancing a little strangely in the background to the beat that he was cutting with. So it's kind of like, he's into music and rhythm. So I think my parents thought, well, we'll try him out, audition him for this choir.
Okay.
So I auditioned in 2001 when I was in year 4 and was accepted as one of the 10 boys that was taken in each year. So I started in January, end of January, February of 2002, and spent 8 years there until 2009, so 8 school years. From year 5 to 12, and that was every Sunday in at the cathedral except for holidays.
Yeah, so what exactly did that look like? Were you going there for rehearsals after school, or was this just a weekend thing?
No, it was quite strenuous in hindsight. At the time, it was just what you were doing, so you just did it. But the Cathedral College took in 10 boys in year 5 each year, and there was a special year 5-6 composite class that consisted of 20 boys that then filtered into the year 7 to 12 school. So 10 boys were taken in year 5, and now they've brought that back to year 3, so they have year 3 up, because they found that taking in boys in year 5 only gave them about 2 years of having that higher voice before their voice would change, and it wasn't really worth the investment, so now they have year 3 onward.
So you were also receiving your schooling there as well as the musical education?
Yeah, so we had a 7:30 a.m. rehearsal for an hour and a half each morning, Monday to Friday. And then school would start at 8:45 and we'd be over there around 9 for the first lesson. And Wednesday evenings we would join up from 4:30 to 7 p.m. with the men of the choir. And that's when we could combine together and sing through polyphony and other works that we'd learnt during the mornings. And then on a Sunday morning you'd turn up at around 9 and Mass would be at 10:30. So it's quite a lot each week.
Yes.
And when you've got your 2-week holidays and then your 6-week break or so after Christmas, you'd be off for January. You appreciated that downtime.
Yeah, I can
but
imagine.
Then you were ready to get back into it when you did.
Yeah, how wonderful. So what then happened after year 6? Was there a continuation?
Yeah, no, nothing really changed except that you would go from a class of 20 boys in a small little classroom with a specific teacher in a composite class of only choir boys. And then year 7 you would filter in, same building, same school, same everything, same uniform and all the rest. You'd filter into the year 7 class, which would have about 110 boys or so from around Sydney.
Yeah, how wonderful. And that's where you did all of your high school schooling?
Yep. Year 5 and 6 there in the composite class for the choir, and then 7 to 12 as well.
Yeah, okay.
All spent there.
And now, so it sounds like you've been Catholic all of your life. So we hear a lot of conversion stories, and you get the conversion story like mine where, I left the church and went crazy for decades, but something happened to then bring me back. Was there a period in your life when you started to drift away from the faith, and what happened for you to take your faith more seriously?
Yeah, I don't think I never experienced any kind of questioning on any serious level. I think for me, having that exposure to the beauty of the church's musical patrimony, and then coupled along the way with its context in the liturgical expression, not just isolated as music on the radio or music at a concert, as profound and beautiful an experience as that can be, but coupled with the liturgical context, I think that, along with my probably annoying trait of questioning a lot of things, perhaps even facetiously, like one teacher told me in high school, I learnt a lot at a younger age, which gave me the ability to appreciate it. And I think had I not had that exposure to the great musical tradition, and probably, as the saying goes, if you keep busy, there's not much room for idleness.
Yeah.
Having been so busy in that year 5 to year 12 bracket, with choir activity, with schooling activities, and coupled with the choir, you had to take on a musical instrument. So I took on the cello. So I learnt cello the whole way through that as well. I think that experience of being so immersed, so steeped in something, and having a natural affinity with music and with my Irish parents, being quite open to the idea of something other than what you're in. So, well, I'm in Australia and I'm an Australian citizen, but my parents are not. I speak English, or a version of it. My mother does not. So the idea of having things that were foreign to me was really not an issue. In fact, if anything, it made me think, oh wow, what's that other tradition? What's that other expression of language or music? And mum speaking Gaelic. I had a lot of songs growing up, Gaelic laments and Irish melodies and such. So I think having all that experience at a young age probably left me no room or time to think, what's this all about? There was so much to keep me satisfied, so much to keep the brain active. I didn't really have time to think, what's it all about? Obviously, you asked those questions as well, but I did have a lot to answer them with already, with what I was experiencing.
Wonderful. Yeah. So it sounds like you pretty much made the faith your own quite early on.
Yes.
Then.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you would owe that to the type of upbringing that you have, being completely immersed in faith and in beauty and in the liturgy.
Yep. And I also think just having good role models. A lot of good lay and clerical folk over the years, having good conversations with them, and obviously, seeing people practice the faith with charity and with joy. Not that that's a prerequisite 24/7 to walk around with a smile, but to have, maybe joy is not the right word, but a peace and a restfulness with which they approach things. As emotive beings, we get perturbed and pushed off from time to time, but if there's an underlying reason behind which you do things, certainly seeing people like that growing up gave me a lot to kind of look up toward and emulate.
Excellent. And was there particularly strong catechesis in the Orthodox Catholic faith at school as well?
Not really. No. No. The faith
amazing?
teaching at the school was quite lacking.
It was certainly my experience of Catholicism in Catholic schools, in primary school in the 80s and then high school in the 90s. So,
the disparity, in fact, between the liturgical and musical context and sometimes the catechetical context of the choir life was quite different to the school life. And that, if anything, gave me opportunity to be apologetic and to speak out against things, even if I did it probably in hindsight lacking a little charity. And
we all tend to start out like that when we get into a bit of apologetics.
Overzealous.
Yes.
One morning, as an anecdote, the science teacher was taking our roll and said, tomorrow's the Assumption, and he went to that school, funnily enough. He said, now because some woman whizzed off into heaven, body and soul, we have to miss biology tomorrow morning and go to Mass. And of course I piked up from the back and got in trouble, but the other students kind of liked the fact that there was someone challenging the comments that really shouldn't be passed in any context, let alone one of inequality between a teacher and students. To make a disparaging comment against something that the school's doing is never appropriate, really. So there was a fair bit of that throughout high school, such to the point that I was dubbed Father Reilly, and I'd say I can hear your confession, but it won't be absolved. So little things like that. But
and you may tell others.
Yeah, and I'm not bound to secrecy.
That's right.
There's no seal of confession here.
Yes.
But I think it just proves the point that if you're given some amount of knowledge and understanding and equipped to defend certain aspects of the faith that are challenged nowadays or just generally hard to understand and to grapple with, that can become quite useful in helping other people understand it as well. But probably not the ideal context to be doing it in a classroom, taking on a teacher. Not ideal.
Yeah, fair enough. So what did life then look like for you after high school?
Yeah, so I was quite an eager beaver in terms of travel, and obviously almost all my family are in Ireland. Some in the States as well, in America. So I finished my last exam on Mum's birthday, November 3rd, 2009, and I was on a plane November 4th over to Europe. Probably not the nicest way to do things, see you guys. But that's where I was at. I went straight over to Europe and walked the last week of the Camino.
Wow.
Spent a couple of weeks at some monasteries in France.
You're the ripe old age of 18, one would assume. At this
yeah,
point.
but having done a few trips prior to that with family,
yes.
It was very, I was just eager to kind of go out and see things and experience aspects of the faith and music that you can't experience in Australia.
Yeah, look, a lot of people post high school, and it was a little later for me. I went travelling in around 23. We're going off just to see and experience the world, but it sounds to me very much that because the faith was so strong with you, travel in Europe also had a faith-based
very much
objective to it.
Yeah, and I think planning my trip essentially around pilgrim sites or shrines or monasteries.
Yeah.
Obviously as a very newly graduated Year 12 student, money wasn't really around. So being able to stay at a monastery and offer, work during the afternoons, I'll come out and help you do whatever, which is obviously always an option at a Benedictine monastery. You'd go out and, move logs with the monks or something, but then you'd also have the entire exposure to their chanting of the office, chanting of the Mass each day. So I did that for about 3 months, and then I returned to Sydney in 2010, and spent quite a lot of time involved with Family Life International and helping out with pro-life initiatives that they had going. And that was the first year they ran 40 Days for Life. Wow. So I was heavily involved in that year. And that's when I joined with my desire to come to more, a deeper knowledge and love and appreciation for the Gregorian chant tradition, separate from the polyphonic tradition or the hymnody tradition.
Yep.
I decided I would join the scholar at Maternal Heart of Mary Lewisham, the fraternity of St. Peter Parish. So I spent about 6 years there, learning a lot more about the annual cycle of the chant and delving into that.
And who were you learning from at this point? So who was running that choir at Maternal Heart of Mary?
There was a man by the name of Anthony Elsmore, and he took the scholar there, and there were maybe 10 to 15, it would fluctuate, other gents in the scholar there. And I wouldn't say it was so much an academic kind of rigorous learning like it had been at the cathedral, but it was more a opportunity to be steeped in the week to week, month to month, year to year annual cycle of the chant and how it flowed from Advent to Advent each year. So it wasn't like there was a rigorous schooling in the chant notation, the history of it, the meaning of the chants, how they exactly worked and fit and all that, but it was an experience from each liturgy to the next. And then you take a 1 year and you come back, I can't remember that. And the second year rolls in, the third time you're seeing things, you think, I do remember that. And the fourth one clocks it, I certainly remember that. And then by the fifth and the sixth year, you go, I feel at home. And we had that in a certain sense at the cathedral, but we didn't really do as much Gregorian chant. Maybe an entrance antiphon and a communion antiphon at most. But certainly the other proper chants of the liturgy were not present at the cathedral.
Yes, okay. For those not here in Australia, of course, Maternal Heart of Mary is a fraternal society of St. Peter parish. So it's the traditional Latin Mass that we're talking about here with all the graduals. Graduale Romanum is the song book of the church that they would have been using. And then one assumes that when you were out amongst monasteries and so on, you would be hearing the Antiphonale Romanum,
Correct.
which is kind of the songbook of the monastery, the songbook of the office of the Divine Office or the Liturgy of the Hours.
Yep.
Okay. So these days you would, of course, be called a sacred musician, and that would be your profession. So how did that develop? How did that come about? So you're at Maternal Heart of Mary, you've been training as a musician all of your life. What happens next?
Yeah, so I think it became quite apparent that the music and the context of that music that I had fallen in love with and had, it's obviously a fine line between owning something and being associated with it. Therefore, people think of you as that. But the two come together as they always do in life. I do this, I become more in love with it, I fall more in love with it. I do this and people associate me with that. So that's just how it goes. So I think by the time, I'd graduated from high school, as I said, going overseas and experiencing more of it, I was convinced wholeheartedly of the rich beauty and the need for people to also be exposed to it and given the opportunity, afforded the opportunity, like I had been, to fall in love with it and to both learn from it and to feel at home with it, for it to be something that's familiar to them, for something that is accessible to them, and something that can work on them because of its power as a sacramental, that the grace can be effective. So I think there was a few years there, and obviously with the Australian Sacred Music Association, a few of us came together in 2013, and it was founded on the Feast of St. Cecilia, patroness of music, in November of that year. And for a few years there, and even late of high school, I had been, I don't really know even how it happened, but roped into potentially helping other people at a workshop in a parish, or can you come along and be someone to help out with. So I think I started doing a number of those kind of activities, singing at first masses of ordinations, singing at ordinations themselves, religious professions, 1,000,001 weddings and funerals, and I think you start to become known as, oh, you do that style of music, and we'd like that. So you do a number of those type of events, and I think word of mouth as well as confidence kind of go hand in hand, and you start to do what you know you're good at and what you know and love. So by the time 2013 rocked around, I think when we founded the Australian Sacred Music Association, it became evident to me that I could employ my skill set of both knowing and loving this form of music and being able to deliver it and explain it and expound upon it, that's what I should kind of do. And coupling that with studying a Bachelor of Theology at Notre Dame in Sydney from 2010 to 2014, I'd always wanted to not look at the music as a standalone or an isolated, aesthetical, beautiful thing, and not even as a form of music, so to speak, but to see it for what it holistically is in the Church's eyes, which is sung prayer, and a vehicle by which grace can be transmitted to people, and a real important sacrament of the Church. You have the 7 sacraments by which grace is given, instituted by Christ, but then you have a whole plethora and myriad of sacramentals that the Church employs, from blessing yourself with holy water to using a rosary beads or whatever else. But Gregorian chant is something that's there through the entire history of the Church, and very soundly goes back to the temple in many ways. So it's something that is inherently human to sing, to love music, to appreciate it on a natural level across all cultures and times, and then that's taken in by the Church and owned. So I think having that desire to expound upon the sacramental beauty and expressiveness and effectiveness of the music, coupled with just getting people singing, the far less lofty end of it, was something that kind of drove my direction for a number of years there. And then I started teaching at a school in Brisbane in 2016, independent Catholic school. So I spent 6 years up there teaching prep to 12 systemic music, coupled with a heavy kind of amount of sacred music, and getting a scholar going,
Wow.
much like I grew up in, a boys' scholarship program, a high school polyphonic choir, things like that. And then in the last year, moved down with my family to Wagga Wagga to be closer to both sides of the family and have a little bit more of a rural lifestyle.
Yes. So let's talk about your vocation for a moment. Was priesthood ever a consideration for you?
Yeah, definitely. Flirted with the idea for a long time, and I think it's a very natural reality, and probably where the majority of vocations come from is being in the context of doing things which have a priestly flavour to them. So certainly singing in the liturgy at the cathedral every Sunday for the best part of 8 years, and wearing cassock and surplice and sitting in the choir stalls of the sanctuary. There's a heavy exposure to that liturgical context. Knowing a number of priests, seminarians going through to priests over the years, it's not like, this otherness of a man dressed in black. It's like, who's that? When you know a lot of them personally, it's very easy to identify yourself as potentially doing that. I then also, really entertained the idea of the monastic vocation, and cool. spent many years looking and reading and getting into that. And I have since become a Benedictine oblate with my wife, which is kind of like the tertiary version, like a tertiary Franciscan or Dominican lay order, Dominican or Franciscan. It's the equivalent of that. But yeah, in the end, spend a lot of time doing little retreats here and there, lots of talking with various priests and such, and concluded it wasn't for me.
Yes. So then you considered the vocation to marriage.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And how did that work out for you?
Yeah, so far so good.
When did you meet your wife?
Met my wife through her brother, actually, in a singing group called Prima Luce in 2012. So coming up on 10 years. And I'd been singing with him for about 5 years. Well, no less, about 3 years. And came to know his family quite well. And did what you shouldn't do, which is to ask your best mate to, date his sister. Well, I didn't ask him, I asked his sister. So that was a bit of a shock for a little while. But I think, we saw eye to eye on a lot of things. And my brother-in-law, has gone off now to Notre Dame Priory in Tasmania, and is a simply professed monk down there. So 3 more years and he'll be a fully professed monk. So he's definitely gone down that trajectory of falling in love with the faith and sacred music, and he's a wonderful singer and musician himself and composer. So yeah, my wife and I, we got married in 2017, so just had our 5th anniversary, and been blessed with 3 children.
Yes.
So little Gregory.
Gregory. Was there a particular reason you went with the name Gregory?
No, but I floated the idea of a second name being Ian, but that was knocked back.
I see.
It would have been Gregorian then, but no. Obviously, I've got a great love for Saint Gregory the Great, and indeed Saint Gregory sent Augustine over to England to missionize the English. So there's a great connection there, even in Australia, with Archbishop Polding and the Benedictine kind of foundation of the faith in Australia. But certainly, with sacred music, but also just as a name, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful name. So we've got Gregory and a little daughter, Elodie, an old French name, and Julian, a little son.
Excellent.
Keeps us busy.
I'm certain they would. I only have 2 children, 9 and 6. And they keep me busy enough. I take my hat off to anyone who goes more than 2, because I struggle. You're a better man than I.
Don't know about that.
And of course, so you're continuing to work as a sacred musician, and you're continuing to teach. And recently, that the opportunity to teach in schools has started to gain momentum in a schools program. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so one of the long-standing points or principles or aims of the Church's documents, indeed the very name Schola, the group of singers, Schola Cantorum means school of singers, Schola means school, is to really get into the schools in any context and teach the young children, because they will grow up and they will become the next generation, obviously, but they also are at an age where they are really well disposed to learning, and that's why we do schooling at that stage of our life and not the latter end or the middle end of life.
Yep.
So there was an opportunity in 2018 through a teacher at Brigidine College at Ranwick, and she attended a workshop that I gave on some of the simple end of the chant at St. Jerome's Punch Bowl, just a parish workshop there, and she attended that, and she had herself attended a conference on sacred music in Dunwoody Seminary in New York that Archbishop Fisher had sent her off to.
Yeah.
She came back inflamed and on fire to do much with it, but didn't have the skills necessarily to start teaching it. So she got me into the school there, and I taught about 60 of the girls from year 7 to 12, a couple of simple English chants and one proper Latin communion chant that they sang at a school mass, and it was received really well. And after hearing word of that, Anthony Cleary, Director of Evangelisation for Sydney Catholic Schools, we met up, and he said this would be great to do across the schools that are willing to host it. So by the end of 2019, we had a final mass with Bishop Umbers at St. Thomas at Canterbury, St. Thomas of Canterbury, Lewisham, with about 350 students, and they sang together the Missa Primitiva setting of the Mass, the Kyrie, the Holy, Holy, the Lamb of God from the Missal, and a couple of other simple little chants. The girls from Brigidine sang the proper chants of the Mass, and the translations were provided in a booklet for everyone to follow along with. And Mr. Thomas Wilson from the Cathedral came along and accompanied on the organ. And the entire program was coined or named the Jubilate Deo program. And obviously those two words come from the Psalms, from Psalm 99, praise God, as a general kind of term, but it's the same term or the same phrase or the same name that Paul VI used in let me get the date right, 1974. So towards the end of his pontificate, he released a document to the bishops of the world and asked that all the bishops ensure that the Catholic faithful of the Latin Rite knew this core repertoire of Gregorian chant. So he's got that Mass setting in there, the ordinary Mass setting. And I think there's about 27 or so pieces of chant in there in Latin across different areas, so Eucharistic, Marian, a couple for the St. Peter and Paul, all the Mass responses, the Lord be with you and with thy spirit. So we kind of took that as the driving force or the impetus behind which we would then teach the children in the schools. So coupled with Sacrosanctum Concilium of 63, Vatican II's document on sacred liturgy, asking that all school children be afforded this opportunity to learn sacred music, and then making that specific in the context of Jubilate Deo book, or whatever you'd call it. It's not really a document, so to speak, but using that repertoire. And it went really well. And then 2020 was going to be a great year, and Fisher was locked in, Archbishop Fisher was locked in to offer the final Mass of 2020, and COVID hit.
Chaos ensued.
So asthma went to the side. The coughs were all around.
Indeed. But we're hopefully post-COVID now, so it would seem that those programs are starting to gain momentum once more, and so hopefully we can start seeing more of that sort of thing in the future here in Australia.
Yeah, that's definitely the hope, and there's still, the key elements are still in place, and the desire to do it. When is another question, but that will play out. But there's certainly still that desire and that hope amongst some of the school children that had that experience in 2018 and 19 that are still in school to do it again. And we've also branched out into Jubilate Deo parishes, so we've got our first.
Well, I was about to say, we're talking mostly about school children here, but the occasional middle-aged man discovers and falls in love with the chant himself. So, is there any hope for us? Is there any hope for anyone that's not in school?
Definitely.
And that's what we're talking about here. So, not only is Jubilate Deo going to be offered to school children, but it can be offered to any parish that's interested.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, our first workshop, in terms of a centred workshop, as opposed to going out to individual parishes or communities, which has its advantage, but it's also you're generally working with smaller groups, so it's harder to realise the chant in a small group.
Yep.
If everyone's brand new to it, but it's also, you obviously spend a lot more time trying to do those workshops across a large area. So our first parishes workshop will be on August the 20th at St Thomas of Canterbury at Lewisham, and it will run for a few hours in the middle of the day, and the aim will be to have a historical overview and a sacramental overview of the chant, where it sits now and why it's important, and then to learn the Mass responses, the simple Missa Primitiva setting in the Missal itself, and look at one particular antiphon in Latin as the high end of what chant has been across the centuries, so that people can. It'll be simple, but it'll be achievable with the group. So I think there's already about 30 or so people that have indicated they'll be attending. So it's our hope that when we do a few of those a year, people will come together, have a great experience, learn something that they can then bring back to the parishes, and we can liaise more fully from there. Yeah,
this is absolutely wonderful. And of course, more kind of big news, apart from the partnership between Parousia and ASMA, is that I too am joining ASMA as a student, but also as someone who can help to represent ASMA and help with events and so on. So at the August 20 event in Lewisham, you can also meet me, and you can come. I'll be standing in front of this banner, and I'll be bringing some Parousia resources as well because of our new partnership. So get in touch if there's something that you would like to buy but would like to save on postage. You can always get it from me at this particular event.
Yep.
Ronan, what would you say to someone who's listening to this podcast and thinking to themselves, that's all good and everything, but I'm not really interested in that chant stuff?
That's a good question. I suppose more context would be required to give a full answer.
Indeed.
If you're Catholic, I would ask of what rite. If it's Latin rite, I would say not knowing of the chant tradition would be akin to not knowing your grandparents or not knowing something important about your familial patrimony. I wouldn't go as far as to say it'd be like being adopted and being totally divorced from your tradition, but I would challenge anyone that the chant tradition is not an icing on the cake. It's not an added extra, the loaded to the fries. It's something that's far more substantive.
Yes. It's essential. It's an integral part of the liturgy.
Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. So the pars integra, it's something that's integral to the liturgy. It's a component which, if left out, will make the cake flop. And you could still have a Mass, of course, and you can still recite the Divine Office, of course, without its sung expression. But it will be like watching a black and white movie in mute. There will be something that is less and something that is missing and something that experientially should be there normatively, but the Church as a great mother allows ways in which things can still operate, still function, still work to a lesser degree, and obviously that's come about through the centuries for various reasons. Yeah,
and I would add to that as well through my own studies in liturgy. I've learned a lot from the Liturgy Guys podcast, which is a wonderful podcast. I've started listening a lot to the Square Notes podcast, which is another one I highly recommend. But one thing I've learned too is the difference between secular music and chant has a lot to do with the word. And so the way I've taught it in liturgy studies is I ask them to have a listen to a chant, and I do a Glory Be in a very simple tone. And I ask them to pick the time signature. So could you give us a Gloria Patri in a simple tone, and we'll have the listeners see if they can pick the time signature.
Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
So what was the time signature? It's a trick question, isn't it?
3/4. It's Trinitarian.
That's three. That's Trinitarian. It's actually a trick question because what you find with the chant is that there is no time signature. Because if I'm correct in this, that the melody actually grows out of the text. In other words, it grows out of the word. And who is the Word, Catholics? Christ himself.
Yep.
But when you start to hear at Mass that 32-bar blues beat, all right, you're about to find that the word is about to become subservient to the beat rather than the melody being subservient to the word itself. Is that a good way of describing it?
Yeah. And that's one of the kind of essential beauties of the chant, is that because of that primacy of the text, which 9 times out of 10, or 99 times out of 100 even, the text is scriptural.
Yes.
And one of the things that I've learned over the years, which has given me great cause for admiration and inspiration of the chant itself, is that not only does the melody come forth from the chant text and the accents of the actual words in the Latin, the word dominus, there's an elongation of the O of do, because that's where the ancient Latins would have accented that word, dominus. They wouldn't have said dominus or dominus. And the chant melody will reflect that in some way or shape or form. But when you realize that a lot of the ancient chant melodies, not only do they respect the words, but they respect the Church's understanding of the words, i.e. if you take a paragraph of text and you work out which word is most important to the Church, i.e. through the Church Fathers' commentaries on that text.
Dominus, which means Lord, referring to Christ himself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a given word in an ancient chant melody that is of prime importance in that context will generally have a melodic high point, or will have a slowing down on it, or will have a low point, a kind of a grave accent. There'll be something about that.
Adding a gravity to it almost.
And there'll be something about that particular point in that particular chant that has a particular melody attached to it that isn't recycled elsewhere, which does happen, to bring that out according to the Church's understanding of that text. And that's why really the chant is the distillation of belief of the Church in musical form, just like sculpting or painting or architecture or vesture or vestments is a distillation of belief in the sacrifice of the Mass or in a particular scene of our Lord's life in art forms. The music of the Church does that through the chant to express the belief that the Church has on a particular text.
Isn't that amazing? Absolutely incredible. And of course, in the modern world, we also know from scientific experiments that not only listening to, but even more so, singing Gregorian chant or chanting Gregorian chant actually has very positive physiological effects on the human body. Have you experienced much of that yourself?
Probably, without knowing it.
Without knowing it, yeah. Were you aware of the fact that there has been scientific experiments which have shown, particularly with the advent of MRIs and stuff, where they've put these machines on sort of monks chanting, that all sorts of things goes on in the brain, and that the physiological effects, it lowers blood pressure, it lowers the heartbeat and all this sort of stuff. Were you aware of that?
Not of that particular instance, but it doesn't surprise me in the least that nature corresponds to an order, and grace obviously comes forth from that order, who in essence is God. And if we really truly believe that the sacramental life and the sacramentals and grace, our Lord himself, whatever you want to call it, has effect on us, well then it has to have some impressionable, tangible, physical, natural effect upon persons. It makes perfect sense to think that, I feel such a spiritual presence, or I feel at peace, or I feel this effectiveness from listening to chant. Well, then you can most likely probably quantify or qualify that with the scientific evidence. Makes a lot of sense.
It does, doesn't it? Finally, science is catching up on the benefits of fasting, for instance, and Gregorian chant.
Well, like Eucharistic miracles,
The Church is known for centuries. Isn't that fascinating? So this is definitely going to be a real opportunity, the 20th of August, for those in and around Sydney. Even if people wanted to come from the other side of the country, it's going to be worth the trip.
Indeed.
And it's at St Thomas's Lewisham on the 20th of August. Come along, get a taste for it yourself. And so it's pretty big, and it's a big thing for ASMA too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously being a somewhat young entity of 10 years, 9 years, 8 years, 9 in November, 10 next year, we're still very much learning and working out how best to expose people and to give people opportunities and to foster a real learning environment for people. And there's constant feedback, and that's great. And this, I think, is an event that's had a lot of planning and thought put into it in terms of really honing in what we've done across a number of parishes, 50 to 100 parishes across the country, and even workshops in New Zealand and Papua New Guinea. So to kind of bring that into a centred approach, and our hope is really, in discussions with the parish priest at St. Thomas's, our hope is that St. Thomas's will become a sacred music centre, for not just for the Archdiocese, but a centre in Australia where resources can be held and gotten from there, or people can come to there for workshops. People can attend liturgies there in that church as well, which is beautifully renovated in recent times, to reflect that aesthetic context in which liturgy takes place, where it's all centred upon and focused upon our Lord and His sacrifice.
Excellent. And I believe that there's even a member of ASMA right now who is gallivanting around the world and has just been at a sacred music conference over in California.
Yes, Sacred Liturgy Conference, Sacra Liturgia Conference in San Francisco, at which our own dear Cardinal Pell was present, and he offered a votive mass of the Blessed Sacrament on 30th of June, at which the choir component, the Sacred Music Project run by Mr. Peter Carter.
And he was one of the original presenters or
at
hosts
Square Notes,
of Square Notes podcast.
One of the founders of that. So he was in charge of the music aspect of that, and they sang Missa Papa Michelli, a wonderful mass setting with a wonderful director of music, Martin Baker, from Westminster in England. So a great opportunity, and Peter Carter offered for one of the ASMA members to come over as a kind of a scholarship position. So Mr. Stephen Smith made his way over for that, and represented the Australian Sacred Music Association and networked with various other wonderful musicians in the field in the States.
And so we're very much looking forward to his return. Safe return, we pray, and to hear all about it. And we might even get him in front of the camera at some point. Indeed. It may be a bit of an uphill battle for me, but I'll see what I can do, and we'll find out what went on at a sort of essentially an international conference, isn't it, on liturgy and sacred music.
Yeah, there were people from Europe, South America, obviously North America, Canada, Australia even. So.
Yes, wonderful. I don't know where to go from here, so there probably is one more thing that I would love to cover before we finish up, and so two things really. So my knowledge is sparing in this area. Yourself and Stephen are now my teachers and my mentors in this venture. As I understand it, you've got in Gregorian chant these things, these 8 modes. Could you tell us a little bit about what these 8 modes exactly are?
Yeah. So I guess with any thorough introduction to chant, one would speak about its historical beginnings, where it came from, why it came about, and all that generally comes back to a liturgical and prayerful context. It's complicated from a technical point of view to talk about chant because it's a name or a term given to a body of music as a genre that really spans at least 800 years in terms of composition. So we generally categorize periods of music by a few hundred years max, and even then musicologists will give further inner sections to the Baroque period or the classical period. When we say Gregorian chant, we really are talking about something written from about 800-900 well up to 1400-1500. But there's already a long-standing oral tradition prior to that written tradition, which is still Gregorian chant. So it's hard to talk too broadly about it. But that being said, what's certain is that by the 1300s, the chant is comfortably sat into a musical structure by which we've come to know as the modes.
I see.
Okay. And the modes would be, for a modern context, would be akin to major and minor, like the keys of modern notation of modern music. But the modes themselves, there's many theories as to their origins and how they came about. But what is amazing about them is there are 8 different modes, or 4 families of modes, and the first 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 are coupled together. And for someone like myself with my brain of categorization, when you look at a massive book of chant, you know, yay thick, and you think, how many pieces are in that? Let's say 1,000, 2,000. Are they all different? Okay, they're all on 4 lines. They all share a notation. They all, presumably an old book, they're all in Latin. Is that really all they have in common? Because that's still pretty daunting. Yeah. It's like looking at a piece of poetry. Okay, it's all in English. But there's 2,000 poems here. Are they all different? Are they written by the same guy? Like, what's common to them? To think that the entire corpus of chant, give or take, as with everything in chant, give or take a little, is confined to these 8 modes, or these 8 scales, or these 8 skeletal kind of sound forms is quite amazing. And then to then think that this structure, or this constriction to 8 sounds or 8 modes, lends itself to such a variety and a variation of chant. Inversely is amazing that it opens back out to such an amazing variety and such an amazing difference. And each mode, you know, according to different theorists and different monks, and a lot has been written on it, each mode carries its own sense, or its own feeling, to use a less dense word. And they can certainly be reflective of the season that the church is in, or the particular liturgy, or reflective of the text.
Of each of the individual psalms too, like a lament could have more of a minor feel to it. And
potentially, but it can flip between them.
Interesting.
There are some psalms, like the Psalm 113, in Exitu Israel de Egypto, when Israel exited out of Egypt. And it's attached to a tone that, as I said, 9 times out of 10, that is not one of the 8 modes. It's called tonus peregrinus, the wandering tone. And it's almost certain that that tone itself goes back to use in the temple. And
you mentioned earlier that a lot of this chant goes all the way back. And tonus peregrinus is a particularly interesting one, because there is good evidence to suggest that it goes all the way back to at least the Second Temple, right? Yeah,
and what's probably more certain in that at least framework is that Psalm 113 is the beginning of the Thanksgiving Psalms that would have been prayed at the Jewish Last Supper. So the one instance that our Lord is definitively noted as singing, i.e. the Thanksgiving prayers, he and the disciples sung them at the end of the Last Supper in Matthew. It's more than likely that he sang that Psalm 113 to that tone.
So Christ himself used that tone
exactly
to sing that psalm. And what's even more amazing is that I believe it's a tone most Catholics would be familiar with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
How does it go?
Well, I'll sing a little bit of it, and then give the modern context in which it's come down to us. Da 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 dee 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 dee. Da 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 da. So that's the essential form of it, and then we know it these days in a somewhat changed form, but certainly in its original inspiration. Our Father who art in heaven, Pater noster qui es in celis, sed libera nos a malo. So it has that full range, that full ambitus that the original tone had. And one of the reasons given in some of the commentaries from the Middle Ages is that tone was used for the Our Father, because Psalm 113 talks about leaving the earthly exile, the provision that God gives to the people of Israel in the desert journey, bread, water, and the fact that the Our Father is given to the new people of Israel as the prayer for their journey of exile and the provision of daily bread. So there's this beautiful marrying up of something that's, a few millennia ancient, let's say, but this substantial idea that's connected to it remains the same. And chant, in so many respects, that little sliver of depth in that one context can be applied across the board in so many other ways.
Absolutely amazing and glorious.
It is.
So there you go, listeners. If your ears have perked up or you've heard something that has made you pause and wonder, then if you're anywhere near Sydney in August, get to St Thomas Canterbury in Lewisham and join us for the Jubilate Deo Parish event.
That'd be great.
And Ronan, I can't thank you enough for coming in and talking with us today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
For your time.
Likewise.
And I look forward to many more of these conversations.
Same. Thank you very much.
All right. And thank you to the listeners for joining us and for listening to this recording after the fact. You honour us by doing so. But that is enough from us for now. So God bless.